The Italian mafia boss, Vincenzo De Luca, found me, the wife of his enemy, lying amid a rain of bullets, 5 months pregnant. I still remember the moment he stopped, his blood-stained shoes halting before my body, a gun pressed against my temple, and his voice, rough, cold, deliberate, said, "He left you. I won't." I trembled, unable to believe it. The man who once swore to kill me was now lifting me from the battlefield. The scent of gunpowder, blood, and rain mixed around us. He looked at me as if I were an old wound he could never erase. "Keep her alive," he ordered. "I want to know why she's still breathing." I woke up in the De Luca mansion, not to be saved, but to pay for a crime I never committed. I am Elena Russo. That feeling, that first moment of opening my eyes, it wasn't relief. It was this deep, icy dread that settled right into my bones because I knew exactly where I was, even before the fog fully cleared from my head. I was still damp from the rain and the mud, but I was on silk sheets, which felt like a deliberate insult. I tried to sit up, and a sudden sharp pain in my stomach made me gasp. That's when the reality of the baby hit me, the constant silent companion, the one piece of Lorenzo I hadn't been able to leave behind, physically or emotionally. I reached for my belly, shielding it without even thinking, a gesture that was more primal than logical. I looked around at the room. It was huge, all dark wood and intimidating luxury, the kind of place that wasn't designed for comfort but for showing off power. It was a gilded cage, and the lock was probably on the outside. My husband, Lorenzo, the one who swore he loved me, had used me as a shield, tossing me out of the armored car and speeding away with his cronies when Vincenzo's men cornered them. I wasn't a wife. I was just a distraction, a piece of trash to slow down the pursuit, and the memory of the sheer casual cruelty of it, the way his eyes slid right past me, that hurt more than the near-death experience. When the guard finally checked on me, a large man with eyes that looked right through you, like I was furniture, I just lay there, perfectly still, breathing slow and shallow. I didn't ask where I was or what was happening. I didn't beg for water. That's something I learned growing up with nothing. When you're cornered, the last thing you give up is your dignity. Begging just confirms their power over you, and I couldn't afford to be weak. I was the wife of a man who had betrayed the whole organization, who had stolen money and sold secrets, and I was 5 months pregnant with his child, left right in the crossfire. The only reason I was still breathing was because Vincenzo, the ruthless boss who should have executed me on the spot, was curious. Maybe he was suspicious, or maybe he was just sadistic, wanting to drag out the punishment, but I figured I had maybe 24 hours before he got the answers he wanted and decided I was too much trouble to keep around. That's the way that life worked. Everything was transactional, and my value had dropped to zero the moment Lorenzo's tires squealed away in the night. The silence in that opulent room was deafening, occasionally broken by the distant muffled sound of a door closing or a car pulling up outside. Each noise reminding me how completely I was trapped, a living exhibit of my husband's failure. I'm going to pause for just a second, right here. If you've ever felt that feeling, you know it. When you realize the ground you were standing on wasn't real, and you're just floating in a huge, scary space. It's a lonely feeling, and knowing that others have been there too, that makes all the difference. If you're watching this and it's hitting home, would you mind taking a quick second to do a few things? Just grab your phone, hit the like button for me, and leave a comment below. It helps this story reach other people who might need to hear it. And please, if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. I'm telling you this story because I need to, but also because I need you to know that you're not alone in whatever you've carried. Thanks truly. Okay, back to the mansion, because that's when things really started to get complicated. The main conflict started with the interrogation a few days after I woke up. Vincenzo came into the room, no knock, no warning. The air just changed. He didn't walk, he moved, and every single person in that large room, including the 2 guards and the nurse who was checking my vitals, just went absolutely still. He was a presence, the kind of man you cross the street to avoid, not because he looked flashy, but because he looked like he could decide your fate without blinking. He was 40 maybe, but his eyes looked older, empty of anything warm. He wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, but it didn't hide the coiled tension in his shoulders. He didn't sit. He just stood by the large, ornate fireplace, looking down at me like I was a smudge on his marble floor. He didn't raise his voice, which was maybe the scariest part. His questions were soft like sandpaper. "Where is Lorenzo?" he asked, and the way he said my husband's name made it sound like a curse, a foul taste in his mouth. I knew the drill. Even though Lorenzo was trash, I wasn't going to roll over immediately. I looked at the floor. shaking my head slightly, trying to make my voice sound weak and lost, which, honestly, wasn't hard to do. I don't know, I whispered, barely moving my lips. He never told me anything. Vincenzo took a single, slow step closer, and the sound of his expensive leather shoe on the floor was the loudest noise I had ever heard. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice dropping another octave. "People who lie to me usually lose things they like their fingers." I kept my eyes down, but I couldn't stop the tears that had been building since I was tossed onto the pavement. I wasn't crying for Lorenzo. I was crying for the life I'd lost, the illusion of safety, and the absolute, total abandonment. "I don't know," I repeated, a little louder this time. "He left me. He just left me to die." And then I broke, the sobs coming up sharp and raw from my chest. He didn't move for a long moment, just standing there, letting the sound of my grief fill the massive space. Then I heard the click, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. I didn't need to look up to know it was pointed right at me. I wasn't worried for myself, not really. I'd already accepted my death the night of the rain. But the baby was innocent, and I couldn't bear the thought of it ending like this, wrapped up in a war it had nothing to do with. Instinctively, my hands flew down and cupped over my stomach, a fragile, useless shield against the bullet. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the end, but it didn't come. Instead, Vincenzo's cold voice came again. Closer now, almost a whisper. "You're begging for mercy. For his child," he asked, and I could hear the confusion. The shock. Maybe even a tiny flicker of something else in his tone. I opened my eyes and looked straight up at him for the first time. The gun was still raised, pointed right at the space between my eyebrows, but his hand was frozen, the tension in his grip almost visible. My voice was a tiny, ragged sound, completely stripped of any defiance or theatricality. "Because it's innocent," I whispered, the plea directed not at him, but at the sheer unfairness of it all. Whatever Lorenzo did, whatever I am, the baby is innocent. And that's when it happened, the thing that saved me. The cold mask on his face cracked just for a second. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was recognition, the kind of deep, internal pain that only comes from knowing betrayal. I saw it flash in his eyes, a memory of a woman, a ghost, the realization that I was another wife abandoned by a traitor, another victim left to carry the consequences. It was the pain reborn in a different form, right in front of him, and he lowered the gun. He didn't holster it, just dropped his hand to his side, the silence stretching out between us until it felt like it might snap. "Keep her here," he finally ordered, his voice thick and uneven, the spell broken. "But anyone touches her, dies." Psst. He turned and left the room just as abruptly as he had entered, leaving me breathing hard, the lingering metallic smell of the gun, a sharp reminder of how close I had come to the end and how utterly complicated my immediate future had just become. Being a prisoner in a golden cage is maybe worse than a dungeon, because the luxury just highlights your helplessness. I was surrounded by beauty, original art, huge terraces overlooking immaculate gardens, servants who moved like ghosts, but I couldn't open a door without permission. The real humiliation, though, came from the other women, the wives and sisters and daughters of the DeLuca organization. They were gorgeous, polished, and vicious, and they saw me as a curiosity, a weak spot, a scandal waiting to happen. They would parade past my room, sometimes stopping at the door, their conversations loud enough to cut through the thick wood. "Look at her," one would sneer, her voice dripping with venom. "The pregnant snake sleeping in the boss's house." Another would chime in, "You'll actually give birth to a traitor's child under this roof? It's an insult to the family." They didn't even care if I heard them. In fact, I think they hoped I did. They were insecure, their own status dependent on the men they married, and seeing me, the disgraced wife of a fallen boss, elevated by Vincenzo's strange protection, drove them crazy. They couldn't understand why he hadn't executed me, and in their twisted world, what you can't understand you try to destroy. One day, Matteo came in. He was Vincenzo's nephew, only about 22, sharp, loyal, and the only person in the house who didn't seem to look at me with either hatred or cold curiosity. He brought me a small bowl of fresh fruit, which was a kindness in a house where every meal felt like an obligation, not a courtesy. He didn't say anything, just set the bowl on the bedside table, his eyes darting quickly to my face and then away. I caught the pity in his gaze, a genuine, unguarded sorrow that felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't want pity. Pity was just another way of acknowledging my inferior status. I just nodded a thank you, keeping my expression neutral, and he turned to leave. Before he reached the door, I spoke, my voice low. "Why?" I asked him. "Why does he keep me here?" Matteo stopped dead, his back to me, the air thickening around us. He didn't answer right away, and when he finally did, his voice was barely a whisper. "Your evidence, Elena," he said, using my name for the first time, and it felt shockingly intimate. "You're living proof of Lorenzo's betrayal. You're not here because of mercy. You're here because you're useful to the boss's vengeance." The cold, precise logic of his words hit me like a splash of ice water, clearing away any lingering hope I might have held about Vincenzo's sudden moment of compassion. I was an instrument, a trophy, a means to an end, and knowing the truth of my situation, somehow gave me back a tiny sliver of control. It was during a routine medical checkup that the whole game changed again, pulling the rug out from under the fragile new understanding I'd started to build. Vincenzo had his own private doctor, a stern, older woman named Dr. Rossi, who was fiercely loyal and unnervingly quiet. She was checking the baby's growth, the little heartbeat sounding strong and frantic on the monitor, when she suddenly paused, looking at the printout with a frown. I was watching her face, trying to read the non-existent expression when Vincenzo walked in. He always seemed to materialize in the room at the worst possible moment. He didn't say anything, just stood there by the foot of the bed, demanding information with his silence. Dr. Rossi looked up at him, then down at the results, her voice barely a murmur, professional and low. "Signore De Luca," she said, carefully folding the paper, "the baby's blood type. It doesn't match Lorenzo Russo's." The silence that followed was monumental. It wasn't just a medical fact, it was a detonation. Vincenzo froze where he stood, not moving a muscle, but I could feel the temperature in the room plummet. His eyes fixed on me, and for the first time, I saw genuine, raw shock. Not anger, but a profound, calculating disbelief, as if the entire structure of his world had just shifted. I started to tremble uncontrollably. This secret, this terrifying piece of my past, was out, and I knew I had to tell the whole truth, or I was dead. I had held on to it out of fear, thinking Lorenzo would kill me if I ever breathed a word. Now, the fear of Vincenzo was greater. My voice was a choked, broken sound as I finally spoke the words I'd held captive for months. He forced me, I confessed, the words tasting like ash and bile. It wasn't his. He sold me to one of his rivals months ago, before everything went south. It was a deal, a way to settle a debt or buy protection, I don't know. I never told anyone. I was afraid he'd kill me. Or worse, make me lose the baby. I couldn't look at him, staring instead at my hands clenched tightly on the silk sheet. The sound that came from Vincenzo wasn't a word, or a shout. It was a guttural, wounded roar of pure fury and realization. He didn't yell at me, didn't approach me. He simply spun around and, in one violent, blinding motion, swept the glass table by the window with his arm. The heavy crystal smashed against the marble wall, exploding into 1,000 glittering pieces. The guards outside the door tensed, and Dr. Rossi gasped, but I didn't flinch. I just watched him, breathing through the tremor in my chest. He stood there, breathing hard, his hands hanging at his sides before he finally spoke, his voice shaking with a rage that wasn't directed at me but at Lorenzo. He didn't just betray me. He ground out the words laced with pure venom. He betrayed his own blood. He sold his wife, pregnant with another man's child, just to buy himself a little more time. He understood in that moment the true depth of Lorenzo's cowardice and sin. Lorenzo hadn't just double-crossed the organization, he had stripped me of my dignity, used me as a shield, and then abandoned the proof of his own monstrous deal. That night, long after the shattered glass had been swept up and the tension had settled back into the house, Vincenzo came back. He sat on the edge of the bed, not looking at me, just looking out the window at the dark trees. He didn't offer comfort or a hug. That wasn't his way. He just reached out, his dangerous, scarred hand hovering over my stomach, and whispered a single, life-changing sentence. "From now on, I'll be the one to protect you." It wasn't a declaration of love, it was an oath of vengeance, and for the first time, I felt a kind of safety I hadn't known existed. That promise, however, came with a new, heavier burden, the realization that Vincenzo's protection was isolating him within his own world. The house was whispering now, the initial hatred from the Mafia women shifted to confusion and then to suspicion. Rumors, sharp and incessant, began to spread through the organization. Vincenzo De Luca is protecting the wife of a traitor. The council, the old guard, the men who upheld the ruthless traditions of the underworld were starting to mutter about his weakness, his lapse in judgment, his loss of focus. "He's lost his mind," I heard one of them growl on the other side of my door one afternoon. "She's cursed and he's bringing ruin on us all." I couldn't bear it. I owed him my life, and the babies, and the thought that I was now the instrument of his destruction, not Lorenzo's, was unbearable. I knew that in this world, sentiment was a weakness, and I was dangerously close to becoming his. I couldn't let him destroy everything he had built for a debt he felt he owed to a ghost he saw in my eyes. The only way to save him, I reasoned, was to remove myself entirely. So, I tried to escape. I waited until the dead of night, slipping out of the room with a small, hastily packed bag, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I made it down the long, sweeping staircase, past the silent, hulking statues in the hall, and was just fumbling with the enormous, heavy front door when I felt the cold, hard press of a gun barrel against the back of my neck. It was Mateo, his face pale and set, his eyes filled with the sad disappointment that hurt more than his weapon. "Elena, don't," he murmured, his voice cracking slightly. "It won't work. The boss knew you would try." I dropped the bag, the little thud echoing in the cavernous entryway. He didn't touch me, just gestured with his head toward the back of the house, and I knew what was coming. I was caught, and now the council had their proof. I was not just a threat, but a runaway, a liability that had to be handled, or Vincenzo's power would crumble. The next morning, they didn't lock me up. They brought me out. They tied my hands tightly behind my back and brought me to the main hall, where the entire council was assembled, a circle of ancient, unyielding darkness waiting to pass judgment. The atmosphere in that room was thick and suffocating, the air charged with hatred and impatience. The council members sat around a huge polished mahogany table, their faces stern and unforgiving, and I stood in the middle feeling utterly exposed and alone. They didn't bother with pleasantries or formal accusations. The head of the council, a man named Donato, whose eyes held the cold emptiness of decades of violence, simply pointed at me. "Execute her, Vincenzo," he commanded, his voice echoing in the hall. "Now! Prove to us you still respect the code. Prove she hasn't made you weak." The demand wasn't a question, it was a challenge, a test of his loyalty to the darkness he had always served. All eyes were on Vincenzo, who stood at the head of the table, his face a perfect, unreadable mask. I could feel the weight of his choice, the utter gravity of the moment, the crossroads where vengeance and compassion met. He looked at me, and I saw a war raging in his eyes, a battle that was tearing his world apart. Tears finally started to fall down my face, not tears of fear for my life, but tears of absolute defeat, realizing I had failed to save him from this impossible position. I raised my head, looking straight into his tormented eyes, the eyes of the man who had promised to protect me. I knew what I had to say, the only thing that could possibly save his soul, even if it cost me my life. I didn't beg for mercy, I challenged his very nature, his code, his identity. My voice was surprisingly steady, clear and quiet, cutting through the heavy silence in the hall. "Do it," I told him, holding his gaze, the tears streaming down my cheeks. "If you still belong to the darkness." The words hung in the air, a spiritual challenge forcing him to look at the monster he was supposed to be. He stared at me for an eternity, his hand slowly reaching inside his jacket, drawing the sleek black pistol. The click of the safety coming off was sharp and final. He raised the gun, aimed it directly at my chest, and the room held its breath. I closed my eyes, accepting the end, knowing I had done the only thing I could to release him. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, the concussive force slamming into my body, and then everything went black. I woke up choking on the thick, damp air, disoriented and panicked. I was lying on a dirt floor, surrounded by wooden crates and the overpowering, earthy scent of aging wine. My hands were still bound, but the gun's impact hadn't hurt me. I hadn't felt the searing pain of a bullet. I twisted my head, straining my eyes in the pitch blackness until I finally discerned a narrow sliver of light filtering in from above. I was in a wine cellar, deep beneath the mansion, and the gunshot I had heard, the blast that had sent me collapsing, must have been a blank. Vincenzo hadn't killed me. He had orchestrated a performance, a fake death, using the fear and expectation of the council against them, concealing me to pull off the most brutal deception imaginable. Just as the realization settled in, a new sound began, muffled heavy thuds from upstairs, followed by a sudden violent eruption of gunfire, not one shot, but a chaotic, terrifying symphony of rapid-fire runs and screaming. It wasn't a fight, it was a massacre. He had pulled the trigger on a blank just to hide me, and then he had returned to the table and he had slaughtered them all. I lay there trembling, unable to move, listening to the world above me tear itself apart. The echoes of the execution, the shouts, the final, chilling silence seemed to rattle the very foundations of the wine cellar. When the final sound died away, there was only the dripping of condensation from the old stone walls and the ragged sound of my own breathing. Then, the trapdoor above me creaked open, and Vincenzo stood silhouetted against the dim light, looking down. He jumped lightly into the cellar, and as he stepped into the weak light filtering from the crack in the wall, I gasped. His suit was drenched, not in rain, but in blood, a terrifying, grotesque crimson mask. He walked toward me slowly, steadily, his face grim, and knelt down, pulling a knife from his inner jacket pocket and cutting the ropes that bound my wrists. He didn't look triumphant or relieved. He looked broken, a man who had just paid an impossible price. I stared at the blood on his hands, on his face, a silent accusation of the monstrous thing he had done for me. He reached out and gently touched my cheek, the blood leaving a smear on my skin. His eyes empty, as if the darkness had finally consumed everything inside him. "I killed the world," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "just to keep you alive." I couldn't look at him, couldn't touch him, couldn't even speak after that night. The truth, that he had sacrificed his honor, his empire, and maybe his soul for me, was a burden far heavier than any death sentence. He had saved my life, but he had become a mass murderer in the process, and every drop of blood he'd spilled felt like a stain on my own hands. I retreated into myself, finding comfort only in the quiet fluttering of the baby inside me, the one pure thing left in the house of death. Vincenzo, now the undisputed ruler of a newly blood-soaked organization, saw the distance and respected it, but I could tell he was dying inside, the man who had lost his humanity for a woman who couldn't look him in the eye. That's when Matteo found me one afternoon in the garden, a look of desperate urgency on his face. He'd cleaned up the messes, he'd seen the fallout, and he was terrified for his uncle. "You have to leave, Elena," he urged, his voice low and tight. "If you stay, he'll destroy himself. He's already lost too much." His words were a mirror of my own fears, and they galvanized me. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't be his weakness, his tragic flaw. I had to go. The farewell letter was the hardest thing I've ever written, and I composed it in my head 1,000 times before I finally put the pen to paper. I packed nothing, only taking the clothes on my back, but I couldn't take the baby. I couldn't drag an infant into a life on the run, a life of constant fear. The baby belonged here, in this fortress, with the man who had sacrificed everything to ensure its survival. I wrote that I was sorry, that I was too much a coward to look at what he'd become, and that the only way for him to reclaim any peace was for me to disappear forever. I left the letter on his pillow, kissed the small bump in my stomach goodbye, and slipped away into the first hint of dawn. I only got a few blocks away before I heard the sirens, not the police, but the specialized, discreet alarms of the De Luca security system. Vincenzo found the letter within minutes of my departure. I heard later that he didn't shout or smash anything this time. He just stood in the middle of the room, looking down at the note, his eyes going utterly, terrifyingly empty, like a man already dead, all the fight and fire draining out of him, leaving only an ash-gray shell. But the world, as always, had another plan. The calm lasted only a few days before the storm hit, and it was a catastrophic convergence of everything Vincenzo had fought against. The news broke like a thunderclap. Lorenzo, my supposedly disgraced and executed husband, was back. He hadn't been hiding. He'd been making alliances with the police, using the evidence of the council massacre to secure immunity and leverage, and worse, with a brutal, ruthless faction of the Russian mafia, who had their own score to settle with Vincenzo. Lorenzo returned with a private army, leading the charge straight to the De Luca mansion, and the first thing he did was grab me. I was cornered in a safe house near the docks, betrayed by someone I thought I could trust, and suddenly I was back in his orbit, his prisoner again. But this time, he wasn't just using me as a shield. He was using me as bait. He didn't even bother to touch me. He just tied me to a chair in the middle of a deserted warehouse and set up a live feed, knowing Vincenzo would be watching. The message was simple and horrifying. "Come save her," Lorenzo snarled into the camera, "like you killed me." The next few hours were a dizzying, terrifying hell. Lorenzo didn't beat me. He used psychological torture, whispering all the things he had planned for me and the baby, recounting the details of his betrayal with a sickening pride. And then, the contractions started. Small, sharp twinges at first, then rapidly growing into a relentless, excruciating wave of pain. The stress, the terror, the binding ropes, my body was giving up, sending the baby into the world, months too early. Right there, tied to a chair in the middle of a warehouse full of heavily armed men. I screamed, the pain tearing through me, and Lorenzo just laughed, watching the live stream, knowing his trap was working. Suddenly, the quiet of the night was shattered by the sound of automatic gunfire. Vincenzo was there. He had come alone, a one-man army, driven by a desperate, reckless fury. I could hear the fight raging outside, the shouts, the sickening thuds, the relentless spray of bullets. getting closer, closer, until finally, he burst through the main door, staggering, his suit shredded, blood blossoming across his chest and shoulder. He was hit, maybe several times, but he didn't stop. He moved past the bodies of Lorenzo's guards, ignoring the chaos and the bullets still whizzing around him, his eyes fixed only on me. He reached me and immediately dropped to his knees, ignoring the gunfire, his face contorted in a mix of rage and terror as he saw my state. The baby was coming. Right then, right there, amid the blood and the screaming. He didn't hesitate. He took his knife, the same knife he had used to cut the ropes on that awful night in the wine cellar, and quickly, roughly cut the ropes that bound my wrists and ankles. The moment I was free, the next contraction hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I screamed, clutching his jacket, and he realized he couldn't move me. The birth was happening now. He looked around wildly, then back at me, his eyes making a final, brutal decision. With a sudden calm that defied the raging war around us, he knelt down, coaching me through the pain, his voice raw but steady, acting as a midwife while bullets tore into the corrugated metal walls around us. When the baby finally slid free, a tiny, fragile little thing, Vincenzo didn't even pause. He looked down at the blood-soaked cord, pulled his knife out of his jacket, and with a swift, final cut, separated the child from me. He lifted the crying, tiny body, his hands covered in my blood and his own, and looked me in the eye. "He left you," he said, his voice a promise, a vow, dripping with exhaustion and blood. "I never will." Vincenzo survived somehow, impossibly, but the battle cost him everything. He was gravely wounded, hovering between life and death for weeks in a secret location, and his organization was shattered. The council was dead, his lieutenants were scattered or captured, and the De Luca Empire collapsed, mocked by the underworld as the king who lost his throne for a woman. The police, allied with Lorenzo and the Russians, were everywhere, and suddenly I was the one being hunted. I was recovering, physically broken but mentally hardened by the carnage I had just survived, with a baby who needed a future. I realized I couldn't let him die, either literally or figuratively for me. So I took the blame. It was the only way to clear his name and give him a chance to recover. I called the authorities and the media, giving them a location. I stood on a makeshift stage amid the ruins of the burned-out warehouse on live television, my voice calm and clear, and confessed to every crime. The council massacre, the fraud, the entire war. I painted myself as the mastermind, the manipulative wife who orchestrated it all for revenge against her traitor husband Lorenzo. The lie was monstrous, but it was believable, and it shielded Vincenzo. But Lorenzo wasn't done. He was a coward, but a calculating one. He let me talk, let me confess. Then he played his last card, the cruelest one of all. While I was still on the air, making my confession, his men, using my very public distraction, swooped into the secret safe house and took my baby hostage. The demand was simple: turn myself into his custody, renounce my confession, and let him walk away free, or the child would disappear forever. Standing among the ruins, looking at the city lights through the gaping hole in the warehouse wall, I felt a terrifying, cold calm settle over me. I wasn't Elena Russo, the ballet dancer, anymore. I wasn't the abandoned wife. I was a mother, and I was the ghost of the man who had loved me enough to kill the world. To protect him, to protect my child, I realized I had to become the monster that destroyed him. I had to step into the darkness and own it. My quiet dignity wasn't enough anymore. The world wanted power, cruelty, and an iron will, and I would give it to them. It took a year. A brutal, agonizing, utterly cold year. Lorenzo went down eventually, not by a bullet, but by the relentless, quiet, devastating pressure of the new order. The police turned on him when his usefulness ran out. The Russians realized he was a weak link, and the financial ruin I had meticulously engineered during my confession left him with nothing but prison. The underworld stabilized, not under Vincenzo's bloody fist, but under a new kind of power, mine. A year later, the Italian mafia had a new ruler, Elena De Luca, the widow queen. I controlled all of Vincenzo's empire, rebuilt, cleaner, stronger, but no less untouchable. I was cold, precise, and I had learned to wield silence like a weapon. I never spoke more than I needed to, and when I looked at people, they saw a woman who knew exactly what she was capable of. The whispers had stopped. I had become a legend, a terrifying enigma. I was sitting in the study one stormy night, working on ledgers, the sound of the rain lashing against the massive windows, when a quiet knock came at the door. I nodded to the guard, who opened it just a crack. He didn't even need to announce him. Vincenzo stood there, leaning heavily on the doorframe, half his face terribly scarred from the battle, one arm in a sling. He looked older, weaker, utterly stripped of his former power, but his eyes, the ones that had seen war and salvation, were finally, wonderfully clear. He smiled weakly, a crooked, tired expression that was more genuine than any grin I had ever seen on him. "I kept my word," he murmured, his voice husky with fatigue and emotion. "I didn't leave. Just let me stay." I rose from my chair, the new queen of the underworld, walking across the room to the man who was now just a battered, heartbroken human being. I reached out a hand, placing it gently on his chest, right over his heart, which still beat for me. "He left me," I told him, my voice soft but firm, the final absolute truth of our journey. "You never did." I leaned in and kissed him, amid the quiet thunder and the distant echo of ashes. We were never small, even when they made us feel that way. We were never weak, even when they broke us down. We were resilient, carrying the weight of dignity through impossible times. And we were always enough. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and, finally, healing.